dim bones and then got in the car and drove home.
We heard dim bones and then we jumped in the car and came back home.
Well, I bet that was great. Okay, I have the green light. So thank you for being here. It's good to see everyone. And just one housekeeping thing before we get started. When I started the study, I said it was going to be a 7-week study. Well, this is week 7. But we are going to have one more next week. And then in the fall, we'll pick up with the rest of 1 Corinthians. So we'll be here next Monday, just so you'll know. And I would like to point out that we have someone here tonight who's celebrating his birthday. Richard, congratulations, happy birthday. So, well, I used to say when sometimes, I would maybe do a Bible study on my birthday, or I think last year, Barbara, wasn't my birthday on Sunday because you all surprised me with that cake. And one year when it was my birthday on a Monday night, Barbara had cooked this cake for everybody. So anyway, there's a star in your crown. I used to say my grandmother would be proud of me, and your grandmother would be proud of you too. Let's have a moment of prayer together. Dear God, as we open your word tonight, we pray that we would also open our minds and open our hearts to receive the word that you have for us. We are always mindful of those who are not able to be with us because of illness, because of issues going on in their life. We pray that you would be close to them. No one understands the things that we go through in life, but you do, always. And so give us strength for the living of these days. Enlighten your word to make a difference in our life this day. In Jesus' name, amen. Tonight we're going to look at the 8th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And I'm going to begin with a confession. I always thought I knew exactly what this was about. It's the thing about whether you should eat meat that had been offered to idols. And so the way that I'd always understood this was people would bring a sacrifice to one of the temples of the different gods. And the priest wouldn't use all of it. Keep a little bit back, kind of a undercover operation. And the priest had kind of a black market deal where they would take some of that and sell it at the local market and make them a little money, and it was kind of a shady operation. But I've learned that's not what's going on here. In fact, I hope we're going to learn something new tonight, and I hope it's not something that's so far removed from the issues we're facing today. So I hope it can come alive in this session. How do you like what Paul says in the first verse? Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Now, you probably have a different word in a different translation. Knowledge, is that what you have, puffs up, or? It does what? Puffeth up. That must be a King James. And love, is it buildeth up?
No, it's really funny, but
Charity. Oh, charity. That's right. Yeah. Well, that's a tongue twister. So did you hear about this guy, this young man that grew up, and he had some wonderful grandparents who had a farm. They lived way out in the country, didn't even have electricity. But he loved, when he was a kid, he loved to go and spend time with his grandparents and go with his granddaddy to feed all the animals. And his granddaddy would tell him stories at night, and his grandmother would come and tuck him in. Well, he didn't go to see them as much as he got older. We all know about that, don't we? And then he went to college, and he was educated. So he came back and he thought he'd go see them at the farm. So he's back at the old farm, and his granddaddy says, "Son, you want to go with me to feed the critters?" He said, "Grandfather, they are not critters. They are the class Mammalia, the phylum Chordata." "Oh, well, son, I didn't realize that, but that's mighty fine." Well, that night, they had had dinner, and they were getting ready to go to bed, and he said, "Grandson, you want me to tell you a tale like I used to?" He said, "Grandfather, we do not tell tales, but rather we relate narratives." And then as he was preparing to go to bed, his grandmother said, "Now don't forget to blow out the candle." He said, "Grandmother, we do not blow out the candle, we extinguish the flame." So the next morning, as they were having breakfast, a cat wandered in. And the grandmother said, "Grandson, take that Mammalia Chordata by the narrative and extinguish it at once." Well, don't you worry. I wouldn't even know that, enough of that. So who was it that said a little knowledge is a dangerous thing? Well, Paul said that. He may have. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. But if a little knowledge is dangerous, somebody said, where's the man who has so much that he's out of danger? So we're going to talk about the Corinthians who had the knowledge and understood things, but there was something that they were missing. This is what really was going on about meat being offered to idols. In the first century, when people would go to one of the local temples, and you know they had a number of temples, especially in ancient Corinth, a lot of different gods and goddesses. When the meat was brought to be sacrificed, only a small portion of the meat was actually burned in the sacrifice. And that was a practical thing. It was a common practice to give a portion of the meat to the priest and to the attendants. Wasn't anything wrong with that. That's just what you did. Some of the food was also consumed by the person who was offering the sacrifice. So if you had a wealthy person who came in and there was a large piece of meat, then there would be a large amount of leftovers. Some of that food would find its way into the marketplace for sale. There was nothing unethical about it, nothing shady about it. Everyone knew about it. It was the way things worked. When several of us had the opportunity to go to Greece last year, and we had a wonderful guide. She was just exceptional. I'll never forget, we were in the marketplace at ancient Corinth, and she was showing us how this worked. So she's walking over to the excavations of one of the temples, and she's talking about, this is where they did the sacrifice. And then there would be the meat that was left over. And she said, and so you just walk across the street. And there were the markets over there, so they would purchase some of it. It was something that everyone did. We've learned a whole lot by archaeology. When, I think that was my third time I've been to Corinth. And every time I've been, they've had more excavations. One thing that they have uncovered, across the street from the theater, they had what we might call Corinthian eateries. They were like permanent stands. They found the remains of large ovens, and they also found a lot of animal bones. But there was no place for people to sit down and eat. So they think what was going on, those were early takeout places. So if you were going to the theater, you would go up to one of these stands and you'd purchase some meat that had been cooked in the oven, and you could take it with you kind of like you go to a baseball game and you get a hot dog. It was just a convenient way to grab some food before you went into the game. Some of that meat was probably some meat that had come from the temple that had been sold by the priest. But this is what I did not know. Most of the leftover meat would have been for the temple itself. Because in ancient times, in the temples were kind of like our country clubs. They had rooms where they could host social gatherings, where people could meet for birthdays. Richard, you could go to the temple and have a big birthday party. They could have all kind of things going on. And the food was catered by the temple itself. So the leftover meat would go back to the kitchen, and then the next time they had a big gathering, a big meal, they would prepare that. Paul knew this. Look at the 10th verse of the 8th chapter. He says, if anyone sees you, a man of knowledge, at table in an idol's temple. So where would they see him? Sitting at a table in the temple for one of the social gatherings. One of the temples in ancient Corinth was a sanctuary to Asclepius. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing. Now here's a little footnote, a little trivia. You know the story in the 5th chapter of John about the man who was lame beside the pool of Bethesda, who had been lame for 37 years. The pool of Bethesda was technically an Asclepion. An Asclepion, named for the Greek god of healing, was a place of healing, like a hospital. That's why all of the sick people were there. And of course they had the tradition that if the water stirred, whoever got in the water, but they called it an Asclepion. Well, they had a sanctuary to Asclepius. That was the god that you would come if you were sick. You'd bring a sacrifice. It had, now this is what the archaeologists have uncovered. It has several dining rooms, and they all connected to an open courtyard. It also had an area where the sacrifices were made, and it had an area where the food was prepared. Kind of like y'all remember when the Y used to have food service? I mean, everything was done over there. Another thing, archaeologists have discovered invitations to social events like birthdays, weddings, religious observances. And they were always held in one of these temples. Now, if you wanted to host something, you rented a room. And of course, you paid for the room and you paid for the food. It's kind of like the wedding we had this weekend. It was at a venue, an old historic home, and you couldn't bring your own food in. You have to use the caterer that they contract with and all that. Same thing back then. The thing is, they did not give you vegetarian options. If they served meat, you were expected to eat the food that was placed in front of you. Otherwise, it would be an insult to your host. So this is the group that Paul is addressing. And we're going to talk about this. You have really two different classes of people in the church. You have the wealthier people, and these are the ones who would be invited to these social events. These are the ones who would be eating the meat that would be offered to idols. And they would be the one that would know the meat that was in front of them had been a sacrifice to another god. But they didn't have any problems eating this. And what is it Paul says? Down in verse, he gives a great argument about this. Look at the 4th verse. He said, well, when it comes to eating food offered to idols, we know an idol has no real existence. I mean, there's nothing there. So really, there's no problem. They had this understanding. They didn't have an issue with it. But they considered the weaker, that's the word Paul uses, the weaker ones who did object to this as just being rather ignorant and superstitious. But for the poorer members of the congregation, the ones who never got invited to these big events, the one Paul calls the weaker, meat was not part of their diet. They rarely ever had meat. Now, they would have some public events and religious festivals where meat would be distributed, and they probably knew that it had been offered to an idol. But their issue was not that they were eating this meat or even had the option to eat that meat. Their issue was the rich people in the church. They were always there eating this meat, and they didn't like it. And there's something else that you have to read between the lines. It is a reasonable assumption that Paul's nemesis, Apollos, would have been one of the regulars at the social events, eating the meat offered to idols, having no qualms about it. So Paul goes into this really good argument about that. It's really no big deal. And you can read his logic, his reason. And then when he comes to the conclusion, you think he's going to say, so there's nothing wrong with this, don't worry about it. But that's not what he says. He has a bombshell that he drops when he said, even though I have no problem with it, if it offends my brother, I'm not going to do it. By the way, the Christians we've discovered referred to this as food offered to fake gods. Food offered to fake gods. Now, this is one of these things I was telling somebody the other day. You know, if you're in your car and you have a GPS, you have a map, and you have it programmed where you're seeing about a half mile in front of you, something like that. Sometimes it's hard to see really where you are. If you really want to know where you are in perspective to nearby cities and all that, what do? You zoom out. You go out, and then you say, oh yeah, well, it looks like I'm 40 miles away from this big city or something like that. This is one of these things we have to zoom out. And when you zoom out, we will discover that Paul is beginning an argument here in the 8th chapter that is going to come to a dramatic conclusion in the 13th chapter, the chapter that we call the love chapter. He states here, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love. That's what he's building up to. He states that knowledge puffs up, knowledge can lead to arrogance. But love, the greatest thing, more important than knowledge, is love. And the greatest love is to love God. Now look at what he says in the 3rd verse. But if one loves God, one is known by him. This is kind of a reverse logic. What he's saying is, if God knows you, then he loves you, you love him. What he's saying is the initiative in salvation begins with God. It doesn't begin with us. Remember what Paul said somewhere else? Not that we love God. Or maybe that was John, 1 John. Not that we love God, but he loved us. And he sent his son to be the propitiation, expiation, sacrifice for our sin. It is God who chooses us. It is God who elects us. It is God who reaches down and calls us. So being puffed up in our own knowledge and arrogance is ignoring the fact that there's something more important than our knowledge, and that is that God first loved us. So how do we relate all of this to our life today? I think there are 3 or 4 things that are really important. The one thing this addresses that carries over to every situation in every time period, we have to understand the boundaries between church and culture. Where do we draw the line between unacceptable accommodation to the realities of culture? No, I'm sorry, let me back up. Where do we draw the line between acceptable accommodations to the realities of culture and unacceptable compromise? And if you look back over the years, that line has changed. We talked about authority a few weeks ago, and we talked about the day when if somebody was in a dance hall one night, then they would be called before the church to be disciplined and all of this. There are a lot of things about that changes. I read one example that makes a whole lot of sense. You know, if you go to Korea, Christianity is just booming. The Christian church in Korea is growing by leaps and bounds. A lot of these Korean, especially young people who convert to Christianity, are faced with a dilemma. A lot of them come from families where their religious belief was a veneration of their ancestors. And part of the way they do that is through a family meal where they go through a liturgy of sort in which they venerate their ancestors. So here's the issue. They're now Christians. Should they continue to participate in the dinner for the veneration of their ancestors? And if they refuse to do it, then they're driving a wedge between their belief and their families. Many of them say, well, it's just simply a way to honor our ancestors. It does no harm. Kind of like what Paul is saying. This really isn't a big deal. But others are offended by that. So let me bring it closer to home. How many of you remember the battles between wet and dry counties way back in the day? Now, my understanding is Davidson County used to be dry. Is that right? But you could go across the river into Spencer, or before you get to Spencer, what's that little place that was on the left? The chicken. Hal, you seem to know about that. You go to the chicken shack, and that's where everybody would go and get their beer. So you have the wet counties, you have the dry counties, and that was, I remember growing up, our county was dry, and every few years the wet forces, the people who wanted alcohol sales would start a petition, and there would be an election. I don't think it turned wet until years after I left. But when I was a teenager, They had a big battle going on between the wet forces and the dry forces, and it was going to come down to a vote. And all of the churches, of course, they had to get all the preachers involved. And all the churches were mobilizing to keep the county dry. And we had a huge dry rally one night, and it was at a football stadium in Decatur. And, you know, football in Alabama was always big. I bet it was in Louisiana, too. And high school football, you'd have 10,000 people. Well, we used to have that here in Lexington. Half of the stadium was packed, and they had bands playing, and they had all kind of music, and one of the local high school football coaches was the keynote speaker. But they had invited a teenager, a boy who was a hotshot preacher, to come and speak to the crowd. And that was me. And this is not something I'm very proud of. But I got up in front of all those thousands of people, and I said, well, we're all here tonight because we want to keep alcohol out of our county. But what about all these people who are smoking? Ooh. The next day, the Decatur Daily, the local newspaper, you know, it was a daily every day. Everybody read the daily. The headlines on the front page read, "Teenager calls smoking hypocrisy at dry rally." I had totally succeeded in changing the conversation away from the reason we were there. I created quite a stir because of my knowledge. I was young, overly zealous, hopelessly naive, and just plain dumb. That was not a smart thing to do, especially the next time I saw my daddy, who smoked all the time. And he just looked at me and said, "Son, how do you think that makes me feel?" Well, hindsight 2020. We go forward today. I mean, back then, nobody really saw anything wrong with smoking. That was before they'd come out with all the studies and all of that. And I can remember in our church, between Sunday school and the worship service, you'd have most all of your deacons and Sunday school teachers out front just puffing on those cigarettes before they got into the sanctuary. So where do you draw the line between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable? And that's part of the thing that's going on here. Here's the second thing. This brings up the whole issue of class divisions within churches. The issue of meat offered to idols had direct socioeconomic implications. It was really the wealthy that could afford that, had no problem with it. The people who could not afford it, they had a problem with it. And as Paul said, they might walk by and say, well, there's old so-and-so in there and he's eating. He doesn't see anything wrong with it. How do you deal with different socioeconomic levels within the church? And sometimes it comes out in ways we don't even think about. Maybe the way people dress, that many people can't afford to dress the way that they would like to. I know when Joyce and I were doing the youth, we always tried to be mindful of those kids that didn't have the resources. If we said, okay, next Saturday, we're going to go to Carowinds, to a theme park, and it's going to cost $20 to get in, and make sure you bring your money for food and all that. Well, for most of our kids, that was not an issue. But every now and then we had a child that it was. We always tried to make certain that if we were going to youth camp or something like that, that if there was a child we felt like it might be an economic hardship, we very tactfully, quietly made sure that they knew their way was paid and they didn't have to worry about it. And I remember one young man, one little boy, who went to Passport with us when there were a few years we went to Macon, Georgia. You know where that is, Gene. I mean, you get to Atlanta, you still got a long way to go. And Macon, we were baking in Macon. Baking in Macon. It was hot. It was really hot. And Nathan Hauser was talking to me about that before the wedding. He said, I remember when Ethan was in the 6th grade and you all were going to Passport in Macon, and he said, I brought him up there and I really didn't think he would go. He was a homebody. And said, you all had your circle and you were talking to him and you had your prayer, and all of a sudden he came running to me, and I thought, oh no, he's not going. Said he hugged me and said, Dad, I got to go. I might be late and I don't want to miss it. And Ethan became one of our most active, great leader among the young people. But we had a boy that went with us, and we knew that, I mean, he didn't come from poverty, but we knew that it was a financial strain on his family for him to go. And I think we either paid the whole way or helped him out. But his mother wanted to make sure that he had everything, and, you know, he dressed like the other kids. Anybody remember when those rainbow flip-flops were such a big deal? They still are. You'd go into a mall and they'd have a little kiosk. That's all they would sell, and they were expensive. Well, he got him a pair of rainbow flip-flops. And after we had been to Passport, we came back to Atlanta and we took them to Six Flags. So he's on one of these rides and he has his flip-flops on, and something happened and one of his flip-flops came off and fell down beneath the ride to an area that you were never going to get it back. And he just lost it because his mother had spent all of that money to make sure he had those nice flip-flops. Honey, you remember what you did? Joyce actually had a pair of rainbow flip-flops, and almost identical to his. You remember what you did? You gave your pair to him so that he would have some when he got back home. The thing about the class divisions within the church, this is the key. Paul places the burden of responsibility on the strong, on the haves, not the have-nots. The better educated, they were the ones who he said, you should step back and say, if it offends my brother, then I'm not going to do that. Another thing is, love is more important than knowledge. And this is the beginning of this argument that's going to culminate in verse 13. Rather than asserting our rights and privileges, we should shape our actions in love and the community of faith. Our goal should be a loving community where everybody is somebody and we're all equals as brothers and sisters in Christ. One of the best examples of all of this that I can think of, and it's not about individuals, but it's about churches. We were in Charleston, South Carolina for this wedding this weekend, and one day we drove by the First Baptist Church of Charleston. First Baptist Church of Charleston was the first Baptist church in the South. And if somebody said, if you don't believe that, just go ask them, and they will be glad to tell you. But they were the first Baptist church in the whole South. Of course, anybody know the first Baptist church in America was in Roger Williams, Providence. Yeah, that's the first Baptist church in America. But you have the First Baptist Church of Charleston. Let me tell you something about this church. One of the first pastors was this guy by the name of Richard Furman. You've heard that name. Richard Furman was very well educated. In fact, this church started a tradition that spread throughout the South, in which the ministers would not only be well educated, but they would be, in many cases, the best educated person in the community. We have an example from our church history back around before they had the first school board in Lexington, and you had public schools. There was a time that you had these private schools, and there was a time that something happened, there were no schools for the kids to attend. The minister of this church, and right now I cannot think of his name, but he's one of the early ministers. During that time, he started a school, so kids would be able to come to school. And they said he had the best library, not only in this town, but in this whole area. Very well educated. Some people have said, well, I didn't know that Baptist ministers wore robes. First Baptist Church of Charleston, Richard Furman, they always had a robe. The preachers preached from manuscripts. The services were well ordered. There was always a structure to the service. There was a liturgical tradition that they followed. The services were conducted with dignity and formality. One of the earliest churches in the South, not Charleston, was established not too far away from here in present-day Randolph County at a little community called Sandy Creek. Have you heard of the Sandy Creek Baptist Church? These were people from the frontier. The guy that started this church was named Shubal Stearns. Now, he was very well educated. He actually was from Boston. And when you've heard of the Great Awakening movement that took place, there were people that got caught up in that movement that felt like the churches that they were in were not fulfilling their needs. They actually call themselves New Lights, N-E-W, New Lights. He became one of these, and he and his family left Boston. They moved to Virginia, where they discovered that religious tolerance was not good up there, so they came on down to North Carolina, and they established a Baptist church in Sandy Creek. And they started their own tradition. In this tradition, people were much more emotional. They put more emphasis on the movement of the Spirit. The services were not necessarily planned in advance. They just let the Spirit move. They believed in spontaneity. They had the tradition of altar calls, where they would invite people to come to the front. They had the mourner's bench, where you would come as a public display of your spiritual decision. And they were very emotional. And as time went on, most of the ministers who were a part of this tradition had little or no education, and they became very suspicious of ministers who were educated. The one thing about the Sandy Creek tradition is they were strong believers in missions and evangelism. So they started establishing new churches. They call them arms. Like instead of a new church, they say we're going to have an arm. Anybody know the first arm that came out of the Sandy Creek Baptist Church? Abbott's Creek, yeah. Phyllis, you get the gold star. Abbott's Creek Baptist Church was the first, we would call it the first plant from that church, the first arm. And the minister of that church was the brother-in-law of Shubal Stearns, a guy by the name of Daniel Marshall. And his wife was Molly Stearns Marshall, who was also a preacher. In fact, they had no qualms at all about females being preachers. So women were often preachers in this tradition. You have two different kind of trends here. Oh, one more thing. The First Baptist Church of Charleston also believed in establishing arms. And one of the first arms of First Baptist Church of Charleston was the Jersey Baptist Church. So right here in Davidson County, you have the Abbott's Creek Church from Sandy Creek, you have the Jersey Church from Charleston. Now Paul is talking about different classes and different cultures, really. Look at what was happening here. Because this is the beginning of Baptist life in the South. And both of those traditions merged together. I don't know, some of you all might remember one of the first Parker lectures that we had in this church. We had a Baptist historian, what was his name? Buddy Sheridan. Anybody remember when he came? He was a professor of religion, of Baptist history, I forget which university, but he was considered to be the premier scholar on Baptist history in the South. And he came here to First Baptist Lexington. And he talked about the Sandy Creek tradition, and he talked about the Charleston tradition. And when he came here and found out Abbott's Creek, Jersey, just in the same neighborhood, he just couldn't believe it. He was like a kid in a candy shop. But what he talked about is how those two traditions over the years merged together. So that when you look at Baptist churches today, when you look at mainline Baptist churches, you see some of both of those traditions. You have ministers that are well educated. You have churches like ours where, you know, I wear a robe and the services are well ordered. But you also have churches where there's a lot more emotion and a lot more spontaneity. And you have churches in which there's an altar call, you know, for people to come to the front. And this thing about being suspicious of ministers being educated, when I was in high school and I announced that God had called me to be a minister, and I was going, like that boy, I was going off to college to get myself an education. I had people in my church who came up to me and said, "Son, don't let that college destroy your faith." It's kind of like we're supposed to go in with some armor, you know, to protect the faith. God's pretty big. He's been around for a long time. He's not a little fragile teacup. He's a strong oak tree. But when we talk about different classes, when we talk about different traditions, when we talk about people who feel one way and other people who feel another, we can look at this tradition that happened in Baptist life, and we can see how all of that kind of merged together and came together through the years. So what we're planning to do next week is we're going to look at the 9th and the 10th chapters of 1 Corinthians, in which Paul is really carrying on this same argument, but he's doing it in a different way. So we'll look at 9 and 10 next Monday, and that'll set the stage for the latter part of 1 Corinthians that we'll look at when we come back. You know, years ago, Hal, we took, this is before we even had the bus that we just sold. Because Jim Underwood drove the bus. And you remember that old bus we had? And we took a group of people over to Sandy Creek. Were you there, Barbara? You and Paul went on that trip? I have a picture somewhere of all the people. Polly Rollins was there. Bush and Helen Linder, Evelyn Kepley. Graham and Jane Earl Hall. I can tell you about everybody who was there. We went to Sandy Creek and we went into that other church. Because you see, what happened in Baptist life later on was you had the split over the missionary question. And there were Baptist churches that believed in missions and Baptist churches that did not. The ones that did not believe in missions are what we call the primitive Baptist. And that's why, if you go to Abbott's Creek, there's the big, quote, missionary Baptist. In fact, I think they even call themselves missionary Baptist. And then you go across the road to the old cemetery, and there's a much smaller church, and that's the primitive Baptist church. Same thing at Sandy Creek. They split over the missionary question. But it's fascinating, that history. Well, you all have a